Hello and welcome to Oh What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. In this episode, we're heading back to 1986 to look at one of the BBC's most ambitious, controversial and politically charged wartime dramas, the Monocled Mutineer, written by Alan Bleasdale and based on the 1978 book by William Allison and John Farley. The Monocled Mutineer follows the life and exploits of Percy Toplis, a real-life conman, deserter and alleged ringleader of the 1917 Étaples mutiny. The four-part series attracted an audience of nearly 9 million per episode, which is now astronomical. But despite its popularity, it quickly became a lightning rod for criticism. Released into a media climate already hostile to the BBC, the series faced accusations of historical inaccuracy, sensationalism and left-wing bias. Norman Tebbit, the then chairman of the Conservative Party, included the drama in his infamous 21-page dossier cataloguing the BBC's supposed political leanings. Historians questioned the portrayal of Toplis as a central figure in the mutiny, a role not strongly supported by historical evidence, and even the BBC's own historical advisor, Julian Butkowski, distanced himself from the final production. Yet for all the controversy, the Monocled Mutineer also tapped into themes of clash tension, military discipline, and the harsh realities faced by ordinary soldiers. Bleasdale was clear this was a fiction inspired by fact, a bold, character-driven narrative that aimed to give voice to those who were overlooked in the traditional war histories. I'm Angus Wallace, and as always, I'm joined by Jessica Meyer and Chris Kempshaw.
I suspect that both Norman Tebbit and Michael Gove have stopped listening now, just simply because of the introduction. We've lost those two from our audience base for this episode.
Curiously, not long after this aired, I found something in the Telegraph I carried the clipping for a very long time, because it always amused me that where the Telegraph had sort of said, as Mrs. Thatcher now wheels her handbag against the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation, which had always amused me. Sadly, the clipping is now disintegrated, but I had it for a long time in my wallet when I was in music. So, had we all seen the Monocled Mutineer before?
No, I hadn't. I got showed clips of it when I was doing my undergrad degree, I think.
And I'd read Emma Hanna's analysis of it as part of her Great War on the Small Screen, and I knew about it. So much of British television that is iconic of the 70s and particularly the 80s. Yes, I was alive. I was in the wrong country. I hadn't seen it.
It's curious, though, that even today it is still well known. It makes the press, yet it is. We found this incredibly hard to find to watch. We had to dig up a second-hand DVD that's released in, I think, 2007, but it's almost impossible to find. It's incredible, but yet it still has a hold over the media about the BBC's reputation of representation of the war.
Yeah, it casts a very long shadow.
Can I just say this right now at the beginning? It's a really good bit of television.
I was really impressed with it. I was super duper impressed with it.
It's incredibly watchable. Whatever you think of it as a piece of history, and we will get to that, as a bit of culture and television, it's really good.
Yeah, we've definitely watched much worse things.
We have watched much worse things.
in service of this podcast.
I made a list of sort of really enjoyable things that we watched, and it was certainly probably, when it comes to TV and film, in the top 2 or 3. What's surprising as well, which I remember it being on at the time, but I believe it aired just after the 9 o'clock news, which was probably the time I was sent to bed. So I remember vaguely it being on, but what surprised me was sort of how little war there was in it, if that makes sense. All right, the centre 2 episodes are around those war years, but there's quite a lot pre-war and there's quite a lot post-war.
I would struggle to see something like this. Ignore the political furore around it. Something nominally about the First World War that doesn't really feature the First World War in the way that audience expects, lots of trenches, lots of going over the top, that aspect of it. I can't envisage this being made in this way now, because it's not fulfilling the tropes that we've talked about in regards to film and TV and books that have kind of gained a further fresh kind of stronghold.
There's a really interesting drama in the centenary, The Crimson Field, that I think we've mentioned before, which was quite deliberately set behind the lines in that sense in a hospital, in a casualty clearing station. I'm trying to remember the dates to get my terminology correct. And that had even less sort of frontline trenches going over the top stuff than this did. And I think to that extent, by focusing on Étaples and the bull ring, that felt more of a tradition of it being understandable. The unexpected bit, I think, was it took a long time to get to the war. That entire first episode is not about the war, is set pre-war. And then an entire episode that's almost exclusively post-war, which is fascinating. And for someone who's working on the post-war period is really quite exciting and interesting, and means that this will get a mention in the next book.
I wonder, I mean, obviously, this is based on the book that's the Monocled Mutineer. Obviously, kind of Étaples features quite heavily in that. But I kind of ended up watching it, kind of thinking, how present is Étaples in the minds of the audience watching this in 1986? Because it doesn't feel like it's present now at all. It doesn't feel like something that people know about the First World War. So in that sense, it was quite interesting to have a show like this showing the audience something that they might not know about the First World War, rather than going for the big set piece battles or the things that are known.
I think the mutiny had largely been covered up, and it only really comes to prominence in the 70s. Most of the papers are conveniently destroyed and lost. Interestingly, Charlie's War, I believe, Charlie's War, the comic strip, does cover the mutiny, and it does cover it, I think, 2 or 3 years before the Monocled Mutineer. So it must be sort of swimming round in the zeitgeist.
I'm not sure it was covered up. There's certainly mentions. There was certainly a lot of mentions of the bull ring and how brutal it was in stuff that was being published interwar, in interwar memoirs. I don't think there's ever sort of an official political report, so it's covered up in a political sense, but in a cultural sense, I think it's part of that shifting narrative of what the war was like. I don't think it gets sort of classified as a mutiny in post-war memoirs, but the bull ring in Étaples is known as a really, really brutal place. And the Australians, of course, have a reputation for being bolshies. So not necessarily literally bolshy, but that was quite interesting. I knew about the political critique of the show before I watched it. And I kept looking for, why was this seen as evidence of the Bolshevik Broadcasting Corporation? There's not a lot there. I mean, there's a lot. Percy spends most of his time saying, I'm not a socialist. I'm not a revolutionary.
I'm explicitly a con man.
Yeah, exactly. I'm about the individual. There is no such thing as society.
And most of the troops there are expressly not against the war. They're expecting it even during the mutiny to still have to go up the line. It's not representing men who are fearful or cowardice or shirking their duty.
I mean, they spend a lot of time being kind of angry about upper-class officers and the like, but I don't know if that's enough to call it the Bolshevik Broadcasting Company.
Indeed, but even then, if you know, it was slightly intriguing that the officers still had a status, so the officers weren't necessarily directly attacked. They were driving around and moving about. They were just being ignored and laughed at, kind of thing. So there was still a deference to them. So there is sort of a strange nuance to the mutiny that it wasn't complete lack of. Could break it now.
The things that damage the officers in charge are not the actions of the mutineers, other than I think someone gets thrown in a river. It comes from fellow officers who then boot them out, who reduce their authority.
And the attacks actually on the NCOs, who are not the officers themselves. If you're a red cap who is giving out these beastings to men, they become the targets.
I had a question about the visuals. Number one, field punishment. My understanding was that it was an actual crucifixion pose. And I've seen, sketches, drawings, contemporary sketches, drawings of men in an actual crucifixion pose. Here they were just tied to the stakes with their arms behind them.
Yeah, but when they were tied to the stake, they were also, people say, oh, I'll crucify you next. It's like, you haven't crucified him at all.
I was slightly confused about that.
Crucifixion might be a bit much for the BBC at 9 o'clock on a Sunday evening.
I'm really not convinced about this critique of the BBC as being an example of radicalism.
It's certainly not convinced enough that Michael Gove is still dredging it up in 2014. Kind of, you can imagine him kind of hanging on the words of Thatcher and Tebbit.
I do wonder, given how difficult it was for us to find this to watch, if he's actually watched it.
That's the other thing. It was shown once and never shown again.
To be honest, I would suspect this is actually quite a good thing to show to kids insofar as it kind of shows the pre-war world. It shows what recruitment looked like. It shows how men could be singled out as shirkers who had chosen not to go. Pressurized to go, and it shows the post-war world that's not necessarily a world fit for heroes.
I've read various bits and pieces about Étaples. It's a pretty good representation of what happens at Étaples.
But the violence, I mean, that astounded me for something. If crucifixion is a bit much for the BBC to show at 9 p.m. in 1984, the violence of the riot itself, it goes on for a very long time, and there is an extended rape scene. Very explicit extended rape scene. I was astounded. You could not show that on television today. I don't think. That was extraordinary. And the threat towards the, I guess they must have been wax, I think? They weren't VADs.
Yes. When they were in their building singing to make the men go away.
Yeah. But they show... And you hear the threat and the violence towards these women in a really explicit way that I genuinely don't think you could show on television today.
Yeah, curiously, you get Lady Angela, who is running the tea and cake stall, seemingly left untouched and can carry on operating throughout the mutiny, and the men, when the officers force her to withdraw, she doesn't want to go, and the men say, let her stay.
And she gets surrounded by them at one point, and she's like, is it a revolution? And they're like, no, it's just a bit of a riot. And they kind of pick her up and carry her off, kind of carry her on her way. So there is that sense that, the men know what it is, even with the kind of the unbridled violence and the action, there is like a core center of this is not a mindless moment of violence. This is for a purpose, and the trying to get the officers to accept their terms becomes an ongoing plot point in that third episode, I think.
Yeah,
the Allied relations bit's great as well. The Australians and the Scottish getting along very, very well, and not particularly caring for the English. You know what? That's pretty bang on. That works really well.
What about the Frenchmen in the deserters camp? How accurate is that?
Uncertain. But aren't there a couple of Russians? Didn't say there's a couple of kind of Bolsheviks or Russians in there as well.
I'm not sure they're Russians. They're certainly Bolsheviks, but I thought they were sort of intellectual Bolsheviks in the sense that they've been reading Marx for as much as anything else.
They're coffee shop socialists.
Yes.
So that deserter camp's just outside Étaples, and they sort of feed off it, don't they, by pinching food and stuff. When they're drawn into the mutiny, even when you see the mutiny, it is not a sea of red flags flying. It is clearly not a bit. And the main socialist character,
Charles Strange.
Even he's the single socialist character, but it's not that Bolshevik revolution of men. They were just men complaining against the situation that they've been put in at that training camp.
And the guys who stay in the camp afterwards do, once the riot is finished and those deserters start going back, do treat them with a degree of contempt of, and you're going back to your deserter camp when we're going up the line next week. There is an interesting divide between them. They're not socialist comrades in arms.
I suppose the point at which it does become more of a social critique is the final episode. I can never remember the name of the little man they bring in to hunt down Woodall.
Yeah, the Secret Service guy.
Yeah, when he takes the pursuit of these men beyond the period of the war into 1919, 1920, and murders the Labour candidate or drives the Labour candidate to suicide. And I suppose that's the closest it comes to being the rottenness of the British ruling classes, which is quite interesting because that, of course, is the plot point for about 3 series of Peaky Blinders.
And they blast through it in like 15 minutes.
But of course, Peaky Blinders is wildly celebrated. And maybe that is a shift in terms of understanding of the BBC's perspective.
Because I think this could play quite well alongside Peaky Blinders in a
oh yeah
double.
The other one it reminded me of is Parade's End, which was 2016, I think, which was the adaptation of Ford Madox Ford's book, which Tom Stoppard wrote the script for, and Gary Sheffield was the historical advisor on. That's one of my favorite centenary productions. I love that one. And that's mainly because of the whole at least the first episode, if not the first 2 episodes, are set pre-war, which reflects the novels. And is just a really fascinating. I could see the parallels with this in having a long pre-war setup, which gives sort of the social setting that is then perhaps less disrupted by the war than academics at the time were suggesting. Because I mean that's the thing about Percy Toplis is it's not the war that makes him who he is.
No, he's already that beforehand.
Yeah, it's his upbringing. It's
he's an orphan left to grow up with his aunt who's a bit of a rogue from the beginning.
Yeah,
and his uncle who's a miner,
and the violence that is meted out to him when he pushes back against that society.
So the curious thing about the production is so much of it, and so the BBC sell it as this is based on a true story, and perhaps the BBC would have been. And this is where they fall down. This is where they get criticised. But perhaps this is based on a true story because the Percy Toplis story is fairly close in the TV series to, if you take out the mutiny, to what happened at the time. He does go on the run at the end. He is shot by the police in a shootout.
There is a cab driver who gets killed.
There is a cab driver he had rejoined the army. And was selling black market fuel. So much of it is very close to the TV series. But where it's the placing him at the mutiny is the problem. And his unit was en route, I think, to India at the time. So in theory, he couldn't be there. But there's some discrepancy as to whether he was with his unit. No one's quite sure. Yet there's the anecdotal evidence from the writers of the book. They ask if anybody remembered the mutiny in the 70s, and they got these letters and go, oh, yes, remember Percy Toplis there. Now, it's very thin, this anecdotal evidence all that time, there to place him at that moment in time. But that's why the writers of the book placed him at the mutiny. And this is where the BBC got the flack.
I wonder whether or not it is the mutiny that's the problem, because, it's not that long after the Falklands War that this is shown. And a suggestion that, the army is brutal and corrupt and unworthy of these men. And they do rise up, even though it's not a socialist revolution. It is, it's the latter stages of the Cold War. And whether or not it's just the very fact of men in arms rebelling is what triggers this annoyance, regardless of what actually happens on screen. It's just the very fact that something like this appears on screen. That you could take that out, the story would be pretty boring because the Étaples bit is like the key central moment in the TV show. But there's nothing particularly objectionable, I don't think, about what Percy Toplis as a character is doing. It fits very well with who he is. I think it's the military revolt that Tebbit and the like have a problem with.
So I wondered if it was also, there's a lot going on there because this is the miners' strike. So you've also got, at the start, you've got the miners and the conditions that they live in, and Toplis's uncle ends up
He's a minor.
struggling to breathe.
He's got black lung.
Health collapses, and at the end they do make a point of, this is not a world fit for heroes, as men are all unemployed who've come back from the war again, which draws parallels with unemployment and draws back on Bleasdale's earlier Boys for the Black stuff. Yours are who's gives a job meme.
And I suppose there's also the element, for all that the mutineers don't kill any of the officer classes, there's a lot of humiliation of the hierarchies. So there's that whole scene where Percy goes back to his hometown and in his officer character takes the home guard drill, if you will. It wasn't the home guard at the time, but the reserves drill, and deliberately humiliates his superiors in the hierarchy at the mine, the economic hierarchy. He is an anti-hero in that sense, right? You are rooting for him in his humiliation. So it is, anxieties around deference, which of course have been part of British culture since the 1960s, may have played into it as well.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, Jessica, how do you feel about the RAMC portrayals?
Yeah, that was really interesting. So I'd love to know how he ends up in the RAMC, because that's one of those accuracies, right? That is the unit that Toplis served in. So I might have to go and get hold of the original book to see if there's any explanation in there as to how he gets recruited, because of course recruitment to the RAMC in the war is limited. We never get shown that. We go from 1913 and him playing piano to...
He gets a white feather. He goes into a bar and they sort of vaguely accuse him of being a shirker, and the barmaid hands him a white feather, and then...
Well, that wouldn't...
But it's very subtly done. I almost missed the white feather. It's kind of a 3-second...
I missed that.
It's on his beard. It's floating on the top of the head of his beard.
It's really subtle, and then they make nothing at all of it. And then
he makes a joke. He asks if they keep chickens.
That
underplayed.
Might have been one where the version I was watching skipped slightly, I think. That sounds like a drawing on the myth of that Nicoletta Galacci's written about. Yes, white feathers were absolutely handed out to men less often and in much more sort of concentrated geographic areas than we tend to think about. And a lot of the evidence for it as a social behavior comes from retrospective memories rather than contemporary accounts. Yeah, I'd be interested to go back to the book, to get hold of the book and see how he ends up in the RAMC, because the RAMC is not recruiting at that point. It has this brief 3-month spate of recruitment, and then it goes into taking those who aren't meeting the medical standards for A1, so it's taking A2 and below men for service, and then men who are wounded and being recycled through the system predominantly. So that's, and then eventually men with reasons for conscientious objection. It'll take those who are willing to serve in the medical services. So that was a little bit confusing. And then there's a scene where he shoots the officer in the trench. And I thought, where the hell did he get the sidearm? Because as RAMC, he wouldn't be carrying a sidearm. But I realized he actually, it's the officer's own sidearm. He grabs it and shoots him with his own sidearm. So to that extent, there isn't anything about the representation of him as RAMC, except that they show him in the front line too much. If he's in the front line, he's not going out into no man's land to bring men back. That's the regimental stretcher bearers. He'd be going in to take men back to the casualty clearing station. So that's
a narrative function.
Yeah. My understanding is that the historical Percy Toplis, that was the unit he served in, but it wouldn't have been the way he needed to be understood. Now, in 1984, that doesn't surprise me. There's much less work done on the, stretcher bearer would have been considered, no distinction would have been made between a regimental stretcher bearer and an RAMC stretcher bearer. So that's a more recent bit of granular research or analysis that's been done.
People sat around in the mid-1980s counting down the days until your book gets released.
Or I even got the funding to do the research.
It's like any decade now.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because they don't make anything of it in terms of the associations with resistance to war, which is, there is a cultural narrative of the Royal Army Medical Corps means someone who didn't want to kill or didn't want to fight was a conscientious objector. The elision of the Friends Ambulance unit with the RAMC, which of course is entirely inaccurate, and that anyone who served in the RAMC was a conscientious objector or didn't want to fight for whatever reason, which is not true at all. Again, that's never part of this, which I found really quite interesting, that absence, because his reasons for getting involved are entirely selfish. They're never about resistance to the war. And that's a really unusual narrative. It's a really powerful one, actually, because I suspect that an awful lot of men, an awful lot of their actions during the war were entirely selfish, whether it was about self-preservation or, the men who enlisted to fight because it was a good wage when there is, when they couldn't get a job elsewhere.
What's curious about those stretcher moments when he's in no man's land and in the trenches at the front, I think if it was made today, those scenes would be much more the men against the landscape. The landscape plays a much bigger part in our First World War imagery now when things get made than seemingly then, which was quite, I thought was quite refreshing because it didn't get in, the landscape didn't get in the way of the story.
Where the landscape does pop up is in the deserter camp.
They hide in it.
And the extent to which there is still woodland.
But that is not right. That's round on the coastal area, that deserter camp.
Yeah, no, exactly. But we're so used to thinking of front line with these, but there is wood for these men to hide in.
Yeah.
And he does it again in Yorkshire at the end. He disappears into the woods. He's always heading into the landscape to hide.
It was all a bit 39 steps suddenly at the end. If this hadn't been based on something real, 39 steps wasn't written before it, I couldn't quite work out which was mirroring which. That sort of final, 20 minutes, half hour where he's on the run.
He drives a car better than the chap in 39 Steps who spends most of the book crashing into a variety of things. One of the things before we come back to the end of the book, which appears at various points, is I like, and again, it's it's a narrative thing. It's absolutely fine. But I like Percy Toplis's incredibly quick Superman clothes changes. A point where he meets the woman who he then ends up kind of engaging in a prolonged relationship with, disappears behind a tree and comes out in full army uniform. Spotless
army uniform.
That's immaculate, yeah.
His suitcase seems to have the ability to act as a washer-dryer, because he'll be looking like some sort of tramp and then step out fully shaven with a clean set of clothing on, and then he'll come. Yeah, it's quite remarkable, that.
And we only see kind of towards the end when he's trying to clean his clothes in a river or get changed by a river, and those two young girls giggle and see him. The kind of the less refined approach to swapping between military and citizen. He gets changed real quick and real well for a man on the run, and that uniform is continually absolutely immaculate.
And I was quite surprised that the realtor, Percy Toplis, did indeed don military uniform and did return home as a officer, pretending to be an officer, and had a golden monocle. So there's so much of this sort of, you put pins in truth. You can see why the BBC's advertising department went bit. Thing is, I wonder if you'd put based on a true story now, we'd all sort of giggle and roll our eyes, go, yeah, vaguely based on a true story. But that seems to be.
There was some Second World War air drama that was based on a true story. Came out last year.
Masters of the Air?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I don't know, to what extent do we giggle and roll our eyes at that one?
Or Dope Girls, which is based on a true story. For the people who are listening and I can't see it, the speech marks that need to go around based on a true story are visible from the moon.
I mean, certainly if you look at Masters of the Air, based on true experiences would be probably, or real experiences would be a better way of, rather than a singular story.
I just don't know and this sounds like a kind of a slightly weary critique. I don't know if kind of general levels of kind of, I don't know, historical and media literacy are enough in that, there are lots of things that come out that say based on true story. And what you end up getting is either, seemingly, people believe it verbatim, or historians are arguing in the press about the stuff that's not true. And at no point is there anybody in the middle going, it's a fiction thing. Lots of things are based on a true story. And Richard III by Shakespeare is based on a true story.
Well, would ITV have got as lambasted in 1986 for this if it was based on a true story? Because the Conservative government didn't have a axe to grind with the BBC as much with the ITV as they did with the BBC.
Yeah, I don't think so. Because I think this, in some ways, this falls, and here's another one of my tried and tested weird cultural spectrums. I think this falls closer to something like Sharpe than it does of other historical drama. I mean, it's partly because Paul McGann was supposed to be Sharpe, and then he injures himself in a football match when they were filming the first episode and gets replaced by Sean Bean. But it is quite Sharpe-esque. It's a northern military story. There is a kind of elements of anti-establishment in it, regardless of how you construct those elements. Every woman he meets swoons at his feet in some degree. It felt quite Sharpe to me, more so than something like Hornblower, which is another comparison which Paul McGann was also in.
But of course, if you think of the origin material, you're talking about three very different forms of origin material. So Percy Toplis is a real person. We know that. He was a con man. And as Angus has said, a lot of the biography is right. Sharpe and Hornblower are both fictional creations. And of course, Hornblower is a fictional creation of the interwar period, looking back towards the Napoleonic period, whereas Sharpe is a creation of the 1980s. At that moment,
though Sharpe is actually partly created based on I forgot Harry Smith.
Yeah, oh yes,
who is a real character.
Yeah.
Who seemed to turn up everywhere throughout
who we've already discussed when we talked about Georgette Heyer, because Spanish Bride is her Harry Smith. But Sharpe and Hornblower are based on a true story in a Masters of the Air sense. That there are historical figures who
the Duke of Wellington was real, for example. Napoleon was a guy.
Yeah, but even the characters draw on aspects of people who actually existed, but don't make claims to being a biography of them. Whereas this claims to be a biography of a particular person. And I think that gave the critique its toehold, right? That's why you had the people arguing about whether or not that actually happened.
There's also, in that guy, which is another thing that Sharpe gets away with, and I think that historical dramas are able to get away with in the 1980s, that kind of contemporary stuff, maybe couldn't, is that at various points, and again, because it's after 9 o'clock in the evening, you can have a woman naked from the waist up. Just lying in bed, naked from the waist up. Which I don't know because it's history. I think they weirdly get away with that better than they would do if it was just a contemporary story and here's some boobs to go along with your drama.
I do know.
Because Sharpe does it a lot.
I'm wondering if that's the historical moment, though.
Maybe.
I do remember, and this was in film as well as television, there was a sort of wider feminist critique of, that you could always show women without their tops on, but you could never show men. And
it's implied at one point with Percy, when he's getting changed and those young girls are giggling, despite the fact that he's in full long johns, it's implied that they're giggling at something else.
Yeah. And I'm just, when was the film of Sons and Lovers made? Because there's that very famous naked wrestling scene which caused absolute outrage with the censor. And it's another one of these cultural moments. So yeah, I think there's an element of gender relations and gender representation on screen of the historical moment as much as anything else.
There was one question I wanted to ask you all about. You're both about Dorothy. Do you actually think she's pregnant?
Yes, I do actually. I don't know if that's historically accurate, but I think in dramatic terms, yes, I think she is.
Because I just got a slight vibe of Percy Toplis has been conned, like that twist.
It's interesting because Percy Toplis gets a love interest who turns out to be a con woman herself, who's conning the con man, which is quite a good little twist. Although it sort of felt slightly superfluous to the story. I that's one narrative arc that I kept forgetting about. And she's pregnant, and he's going to do sort of one last job kind of thing, and they're going to move to. Do they say where they're going to move to?
I mean, he does get conned, because he gets conned by her initially until she takes him back to her and points out that she came from exactly the same sort of background that he did.
Kind of thick as thieves type situation.
So I think by then the implication is that they are deeply involved.
And it shows his fallibility being conned by somebody else. This is the moment where it's starting to unravel for him, when he's been conned by somebody else. He's been taken in.
Because he says one of his, I think maybe his last line is something along the lines of, "When I had nothing to lose, I always won," and then gets shot.
And what's funny is the shootout. I was expecting a really long shootout sequence with people jumping behind walls and a chase, and it's not at all. Someone pulls out a revolver and just shoots him, and that's kind of it. Yeah, but Dorothy, it's an interesting addition. Like, what about them to flee to somewhere better was their feeling. They were going to, was it America they were going, Canada?
Yeah, but they never actually said where they were going to go.
They were going to emigrate, yeah.
So it's either America, Canada, or Australia, I was assuming.
At the time, Canada would have been most likely, I think, in terms of the schemes available for cheap tickets. But you do get quite a lot of men going to America.
I do wonder how does this compare to, because presumably contemporary at the time is upstairs, downstairs, which I really remember watching but can't remember anything about. You know, that's similar sort of thing being aired and now heralded as something to, reflect back upon, as opposed to be buried and never aired again.
Well, upstairs, downstairs has get morphed into Downton Abbey. Because
they did, and they tried to relaunch a Second World War set version off the back of the success of Downton Abbey. So, upstairs, downstairs, again, the origin of the text, because that's an original drama, and I'm forgetting the name of the actress who co-wrote it, who died a couple of weeks ago.
Jean Marsh, Arlene Atkins.
Jean Marsh, that was it. It was Jean Marsh. So Jean Marsh wrote it as well as starring in it. And it was, I think it's based on her family history in that she had various female ancestors who'd been in service. But it doesn't make claims to representing a specific individual.
You also get things like the House of Elliot, which I was just looking at in the early 90s, which are a slight evolution as well on upstairs, downstairs.
These are all the ones that there used to be catalogues that came in the post in the US that marketed this sort of British culture to Americans. You could buy these all on VHS, full seasons of House of Elliot and upstairs, downstairs. I don't think the Monocled Mutineer ever made it. Actually, no, it did. The Monocled Mutineer was included in that. I can't even remember the name of the companies that sent them out. That would be a really interesting bit of economic history of how well those different things sold in the US.
So if anybody's listening and fancies taking that on for us, there's no rush. End of the week will be fine.
Well, again, presumably, it being a BBC production, this would be potentially sold to Canada or Australia. How do the Australians take it on? Because obviously they're central to the mutiny plot. As Timothy West sort of says, bloody Australians, we can't shoot them.
But I suspect that the Cairo riots, which Peter Stanley writes about, because we get that in Gallipoli.
Yeah, I was about to say, which comes out before.
Yeah. So I suspect as sort of a cultural reference point for Australian bad behaviour and ringleader in riots, that's more of a cultural marker than Étaples is. It
nicely fits in, though, with the British being the bad guys telling them what to do, colonial master.
Yeah. And as you say, Chris, the alliance with the Scots.
Which I think ends up I think it made it into my Allied Relations book as an example of weird alliances you'd get of Allied relations between troops nominally under the British flag.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if it ever gets aired again or is put on general release anywhere else. Would we be more sympathetic to that, to what it has to say? Or is it just a moment in time?
We said right at the beginning, it's a great bit of television, audiovisual entertainment. But oh my word, the cast! We've got Timothy West, Celia Imrie, who plays Dorothy, I can't remember now, as well as Paul McGann,
Cherry
Lungi. You know, and sitting there listening to Timothy West's voice, I love Timothy West's voice.
But it's a great and it's a great cast of people who go on to do other things. They've got them young. It's just superb. The whole thing, directed by Jewel O'Brien, who did Julian the Crown. It comes off the back of Julian the Crown. It cost. I have a funny feeling. It cost a fortune to make. I was quite surprised. I did look up the budget, and I can't remember what it was now. It might have been through. It was a lot of money to make. It struck me as a lot of money to put that together, and it looked fabulous. It didn't look dated. It wasn't wobbly sets. I'm sure there's some rivet counters that can complain about the uniforms, but everybody looked fabulous. You know, lots of period vehicles and not just the same one going round and round and round.
With a different number plate on.
And a lot of really interesting choices of music, which, you know, having first encountered this through Emma Hanna's book on the Great War on the Small Screen, she then goes on to write Sounds of War, and you can sort of see, I can see the intellectual question that goes from Monocled Mutineer and its use of music, which is really fascinating and completely non-cliched.
Yeah, they were keeping the home fires burning still in 1918 at the end.
Yeah. And there's only the briefest long way to Tipperary.
Yeah, and that's why in episode 1, I think the soldiers are singing it when they're heading off to war, and that's the only time I think it comes up.
But it's subtle though. The music, especially those period music pieces, are quite subtly done. They're not all in your face. In fact, you can say that for almost everything. It's not all in your face. Nothing's overdone. Down the landscape, the music, the violence of the battle. You know, it will be all overhyped, over-ramped now, and it's just well done.
Well, except I as I said, I was surprised about the level of violence in the riot and how long it went on for. Because it's a good 15 minutes of screen time that it gets in episode 2. The other thing the question that occurred to me, and I wonder what you guys think about this, is, you know, we've been talking a lot about the historical moment at which it's produced. How much has our narrative of what are First World War cliches changed since the centenary? What were the things that we think about as being cliches now? Cliches in the mid-'80s. And we sort of assume they are, but I wonder if we actually went back to even Blackadder, how many of the things we assume are the cliches would be the cliches.
We still haven't done a Blackadder episode.
We might need to do that. But I mean, it's a question I don't know, and I'm trying to remember. And every now and again, going back to things that I wrote before 2014, and some of the assumptions that I made then are rather different from the ones I'd make writing now.
But Blackadder's coming from that point of view of authority and problems with authority, which is not that far from the Monocled Mutineer, rather than tragedy and slaughter, which are in there, and they're in both of them, but they're perhaps not as central as it would be now.
Yeah, it's more about class, right? And
yeah,
than it is about futility,
which is the lines led by donkeys thing is actually more multifaceted than it sounds like. We take it now to just simply mean that the generals were stupid and they killed their men, whereas actually a big part of it is they weren't stupid, they were upper class, which is an element I think has faded away a fair amount since.
I think there's a much stronger class narrative, and we recognize it more readily in Oh, What a Lovely War from the 1960s than we do in the 1980s. And we may just be slightly too close to the 1980s.
And it's Ben Elton who's writing Blackadder. He's a lot closer, probably in political outlook, to Alan Bleasdale.
Yes, certainly at this time.
And with the backdrop of conservative Thatcherite Britain, which just gets hidden in this sort of humour.
One of the things in regards to that, just to touch upon, in regards to the riot scene, and it's a thing that goes at various points. It goes through, and I don't actually mind because I understand it. But they have some good kind of soldiers' humour moments going on about soldiers joking, like. But at the same time, it generally still remains 9 o'clock on a Sunday night BBC language. They have the acceptable swearing of of the period, rather than what I suspect would have been the slightly more prolific swearing of the moment itself.
Well, it always reminds me of a critique that was made of my first book, which, I focus quite a lot on how men wrote about war, which says, but there's nothing about swearing in this. It's like, yes, because they're writing to their parents. They're all going to be.
Yes. Yeah, look back at the last text message you sent to your mum and tell me what language you use.
Yeah, I thought I'd made a note about language and I can't find it. Something to bowler hat.
Oh, the Timothy West talks about being bowler hatted is you get kind of promoted back to a pointless job, which effectively is the British equivalent of being sent to Limoges.
I love that, sent to Limoges.
It upsets me that I have so few opportunities to use the phrase "sent to Limoges" because it's actually a perfect...
Yeah, where people would understand what you mean.
I actually thought that the lack of foul language is actually quite refreshing. I mean, it might not be necessarily correct at the time. We don't necessarily know, but I certainly think it would be full of profanity if it was made now.
Are you reading out a letter from Norman Tebbit, or
No? I think profanity could be used as a form of a way of making something authentic because they swear.
Yes,
and I often thought necessarily now. My younger self might have agreed with me, but I tend to think now it's a way. It's a lazy way of trying to make something authentic.
It's to kind of lock, stock, and two smoking barrels. There
is something about the historical evolution of the language, where many of the obscenities that we use as punctuation would have been used for their genuine meaning. And in that sense, there would have been a lot more swearing, but not as punctuation so much as just the way in which people talked. Anglo-Saxon English, as they say.
Yeah, sometimes you've got to say holy heck and mean it.
But also sometimes you have to use various things as a verb, literally. That is what they are doing.
So we've got anything to sum up?
If you can get hold of a copy, do watch it. It's good.
And therein lies the problem. For something that has cast this enormous shadow culturally over supposedly the way that the First World War is consumed in popular culture and by the general public, you can't watch it anyway. It doesn't exist, even on YouTube.
Who do we know at the BBC who might be able to get it onto the iPlayer?
See, my daughter's just been to Étaples, and I was considering sending her in with the DVD for her history teacher.
How's her spell on the bull ring?
Because when I quizzed him about it, he looked at me vaguely blankly.
Well, it's been disappeared. In a cultural sense, it has been disappeared.
It has. And the DVD, to purchase the DVD, cost me £1.75. That says a lot when its value is so low.
But then you need the DVD player.
Well, yeah.
£1.75 of your socialist rabble-rousing money.
Well, it did make me question my own politics. It's just held up as this evil programme to be watched.
In a slightly odd way, it is to the First World War in the 1980s as Lady Chatterley's lover is.
In that sense, I think that's a really good analogy because, of course, Lady Chatterley's lover becomes what it is in the 1960s, not in the 1920s.
Curiously, for all the scorn pod on it, 9 to 10 million people watch it. It's a huge amount of people in the country watching it at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. That can't be far from almost all the audience.
Which is also interesting and slightly similar to, Cyril Fawles's Great War Books controversy of these things are bad for you, you shouldn't watch it. Or you shouldn't read them. So, okay, then where can I buy a copy? It's the Exorcist effect.
Well, like those cues for Lady Chatterley's lover when it eventually goes on sale that they have period newsreel coverage of.
Stuff it like a moral panic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very good. So have we about come to a close? Do we know where we're going next?
Scheduling allowing, I'm hoping we'll be talking about The Boy I Loved next time.
Oh, which I still need to read because I absolutely failed to read it when I was in Japan.
I have not read it myself. I'm not sure any of our young interviewees will have read it because they're in the middle of exams. I'm hoping that once exams are over, I'll be able to corral the three of them on a Zoom call and have a chat.
I've half read it. I'm very intrigued to see what you think of it.
When I bought it in Waterstones, the person who sold it to me said that they really, really liked it.
So going from a historical, I'm not sure it's a historical oddity, but to The most contemporary of representation.
I didn't explain why I was reading it because it felt a little convoluted. Go, well, I'm a First World War historian and we're doing a podcast. And we're going, I just like, okay, cool, that sounds great. And here's some money.
Teen love story. Yeah. Right. Well, until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we won't with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Comfort, Richard, how can we spend the Bolivian? Oh, 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 it's a lovely